Hello and welcome to this episode of Law for Lawmakers. I'm Fiona Rutherford, Chief Executive of Justice, the law reform and human rights charity, working to create a fairer UK justice system within everyone's reach. This podcast is based on our Law for Lawmakers guide, which helps repair the cracks in the UK's political foundations by giving every MP the tools they need to act as custodians of our democracy. The podcast will explain key legal and constitutional principles to help politicians of all parties and the staff review new laws, table and write amendments to bills, support their constituents, and much more. But this podcast isn't just for parliamentarians, it's for anyone who cares about the laws, how they're made and upheld. Each episode brings together leading voices from law, politics, and public life to explore the legal principles that underpin our democracy and explain how Parliament can help uphold them. In this episode, we're turning our attention to law beyond our borders, to the international legal frameworks that protect rights, support global justice, and reinforce the constitutional integrity of the UK at home. Baroness Kennedy of the Shores KC is one of the UK's most distinguished lawyers and a lifelong advocate for social justice and human rights. Born in Glasgow, she is a King's Counsel, a life peer, and was recently appointed to the Order of the Thistle in recognition of her pioneering contribution to public life. Across her remarkable career, Helena has held major leadership roles at Oxford Brookes, Sheffield Hallam, SOAS and Mansfield College, and she founded the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at Oxford, now a leading centre for global justice. She's chaired national commissions and inquiries spanning education, genetics, human trafficking and misogyny, bringing legal clarity and moral force to some of the most complex issues of our time. Her commitment to international justice is deep and very personal. In 2021, she led efforts to evacuate more than 100 Afghan female judges and prosecutors who were at grave risk under the Taliban, a mission that saved lives and captured global attention. And she's now supporting Ukraine in documenting and prosecuting war crimes, including cases involving the unlawful abduction of children. Few people have done more to defend the rule of law on the world stage, and few understand more vividly how international legal frameworks shape the safety, dignity, and rights of people everywhere, including here in the UK. Helena, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us here today. Helena, you've spent your life working both within the UK justice system and on an international scale and stage. And before we get into the detail of what we're going to talk about, what first drew you to understand that justice and the rule of law doesn't just stop at national boundaries?
Well, you've got to remember, I was a student, given my great age, I was a student at a very interesting time when there had been the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a great deal of activity amongst student bodies about that. Although Britain had not entered into the war, we were still very vocal about the fact that it was happening. And I started looking at the international law in relation to that, and what entitled nations to interfere in other sovereign nations' choices or struggles. And then I was studying alongside so many people from the Commonwealth, particularly, of course, but from India and Pakistan and parts of Africa and Australia, and you were alongside many people who were also had their legal systems rooted in the common law, and people from elsewhere. So it was through knowing why they were doing law and what the law was like in their countries and the problems that there were often around things like liberty and arbitrary arrests. And so I was very interested in the international through all of those people. And I was a Scot, you see, so I was a bit of an outsider myself. And so many of my friends were also outsiders. And so I had a great collection of friends from all around the world.
And what sort of drawn all of those sort of features together that you've talked about? What's the
the other thing that happened, just as I was qualifying and coming into the law and doing my pupillage, was that the women's movement became a feature of the lives of young people. And I started looking at the law from the perspective of how it affected women. And that was in the 70s. And I started seeing, I felt quite clearly, that women had another set of tests that they had to deal with, which was about their gender and about being a woman. And you were tested as to whether you were a good woman or not, alongside potential breaches of the criminal law. So there were ways in which women were being judged that were different. And I started focusing on that. So And that's something which brought me in touch with lawyers in other countries, and particularly the United States at that time. But it was also the apartheid movement. I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And I knew lawyers who were in exile in the 70s. And so I was learning about the international from other people, although I was very much mired in our own system. I certainly wasn't trained in international law. And I've learned my international law since. And it was wonderful when at different times, I've been very fortunate in my life in that I've done things like I was chair of the British Council. Before that, been on a committee inside the British Council, which was the Law Committee, which had very senior judges and people on it. And suddenly they thought, oh, we ought to have a woman. And so I was on that as one of I think probably the first woman, or was certainly one of the first women. And I was introducing my ideas about how the law was not delivering for women. And so we started bringing that into some of our work internationally on law. And then I ended up becoming I loved the British Council, and I threw my hat into the ring and I became the chair of the British Council once I was in the House of Lords. And so I've often done those things. But I was somewhat politically interested in the international and what was happening around the world and the ways in which, contrary to law as we experienced it largely here, there were so many aberrations from law in places. And so it was just, I learned it through the good fortune of my experiences. And then, of course, I did a lot during the late 70s, early 80s, all through the 80s, actually, into the 90s. I did many cases involving terrorism. And that usually was about using not just our own internal law, which was what people usually were charged with, but there were occasions when we took cases to the European Court of Human Rights. It used to take 6 years, to get a case before the court. But things like people reading letters between lawyers and prisoners who were facing very serious charges. Then there were issues, for example, of what was happening in the detention centres in Northern Ireland. So I was involved always in looking at the ways in which law was interwoven. And these things are about standards, that the rule of law is about standards, and it's about the rules that we need to bind us. It's very interesting. It always makes me feel, Fiona, that people forget why we have law. And early societies recognised that you had to have some rules in order to live in harmony with each other, that you had to have some rules in order to protect the most vulnerable, that you had to have, rights that basically said that certain kinds of behaviours offended against the community at large as well as the individual. And then, of course, the development of property rights as time went on. So law was created for the purposes of harmony. It's a social contract. And so why wouldn't you also, and particularly the treaties that were created, were about creating agreements as between parties. I mean, internally and domestically, our law is about creating sort of agreements as between citizens, and then as between citizens and the state. And so why wouldn't you then try to create the same sort of language to deal with the relationships between states? And we did in treaties, and have done for many centuries. But the post-Second World War period was a great leap forward in seeking to create a harmonised system which created a template of values by which all nations should try to abide, whatever their legal system was. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I always describe it as a template of values, which then was translated in many countries into domestic law.
So I want to bring that international law perspective into what it means for lawmakers in this country. The Justice's Lawmakers Guide makes it clear, or explains, that the UK's constitution rests on parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. But what does the role of international law play within our UK constitutional landscape? I mean, it's not a constraint. It's more, presumably, you'd see it as a framework that protects us.
And I think it enriches our system of law. It's hard to explain to people that until you start looking at the cases. The many cases that I became very interested in my practice in women's rights, and from the early 80s, and I sort of made a great practice of accepting every invitation to go on Women's Hour to talk about how the law affected women. And then I saw that when we introduced the European Convention of Human Rights properly into our own court system, the way in which it gave so much more power to women to actually affect change. I mean, for example, in my own chambers, cases that involved young women who committed suicide. They were in the army. They were tormented and harassed and sexually sometimes violated and had experienced rape, which had not been taken seriously. They were the people who were considered to have lied. And so they ended up taking their own lives. And the families, the only recourse they had to law was often to have decisions not to proceed with prosecutions or anything, to have them judicially reviewed, to be able to have the court say there should be an inquiry. And really, those, it happened with the Hillsborough, the horror of that football match where so many people were crushed to death and where the police we know now, had lied about what had taken place and sought to blame the football supporters rather than seeing it as being a police failure. And it took time for those things, but in the end, it was vital for the sanity of people that they had access to the courts and were able to do it. And the Human Rights Act has enriched our system, I strongly believe, the rights of the elderly, the rights of children, so much of it. And of course, now it's being, unfortunately, politically denigrated by those who have a particular line on excluding people who have good cause to be coming to a country seeking asylum because they're fleeing persecution. And of course, you have to have processes to deal with whether they have a legitimate claim on asylum, but that involves procedures and having to allow people to come in and treating them as humans while they go through that process. And the process shouldn't be delayed and lasting forever. But the inhumanity of the language that's now used around this and the desire to use it in order to unravel and dismantle something that has become over 20 odd years a really important part of our legal system is a great sadness to me.
One of the central messages within the guide is that Parliament should scrutinise laws for their compatibility both with rights and international obligations. From your vantage point as President of Justice, as a lawmaker yourself, what more should MPs understand about why respecting international law actually strengthens our democratic sovereignty?
It's one of the tools that we have as citizens in a nation. It's one of the things that we have that actually provides us with protections, provides us ways of getting remedies against people who do improper things to us. I mean, I'm not just talking about criminal actions. I'm talking about the ways in which sometimes people have great problems with landlords or with people they've contracted with who've exploited them, people in employment, in lots of areas of our lives. And in family law, we need to have certain kinds of legal protections. Law is vital. And so it's really important that as parliamentarians that we know and understand just how important that is and how getting it right is so important.
So in terms of efforts, I want to speak specifically about one of the areas where you've made a real difference, where international law has also played a significant part, and this is in relation to your efforts to evacuate over 100 Afghan women judges. You've touched on your tremendous sort of wider work in terms of feminism and putting women where they should be. You evacuated these women judges and prosecutors when the rule of law effectively collapsed overnight.
I have to explain that. You see, over the years, I have engaged with lots of women's organisations around the world. I became very actively involved with the International Bar Association when they came to me and asked me to be on a panel after the 9/11 had taken place, and they had an inquiry into international terrorism. And of course, I had done a lot of terrorist work here, and not just in relation to the Irish Troubles, in relation to problems in the Middle East, to Sikh independence, all manner of different kinds of issues of terrorism. And so they asked me to be on that investigatory panel with people from around the world. You know, we had a Swedish senior police, we had people from the Middle East, we had people from everywhere. And doing that piece of work introduced me really closely to the International Bar Association. And then I was invited at times to do different pieces of work for them. I looked at human rights and climate change and took part in an inquiry, chaired an inquiry into that with someone else. And so I started doing this work, and I ended up becoming one of the co-chairs of the Human Rights Institute. And it sort of coincided with when I was at Oxford. I was heading up an Oxford college, And one of the things that I really wanted to see happen at Oxford was the creation of an Institute of Human Rights. And so I became very actively involved in that process of getting the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights into being. And when I was doing that, I started going to, whenever there were lectures being given on international law, I attended them. I was wanting to be really on top of the issues so that I could make the arguments very clearly as to why it was vitally important for students. All of us basically are human rights lawyers. I mean, I say this to lawyers, whether they're commercial lawyers or immigration lawyers or whatever kind of lawyers they are. We all should see the value, the common nature of our humanity and the importance of making protections real. I mean, law is not some esoteric subject. It may be in some rare areas. I don't know about the law of the sea, but all I can tell you is that most law touches on human lives. And so it's important for us to understand that, and also to understand the geopolitics which can affect it, you know. So I did all that work, and during the period when I was one of the co-chairs of the IBA's Human Rights Institute, we were building a lot of sort of rule of law entities inside Afghanistan, and a bar association was created. And also I was making a call at the UN and places to say we should be making sure that the law schools open up to women. We want women judges. We want the fact that women experience, coming from all of my work over the years on women's rights, we know that the law doesn't deliver for women, and that'll be true everywhere in the world, because law on the whole is man-made. Those who have power make law, and therefore we have to try and do something about it. And so I was very vocal on all of that. I got to know one or two of the senior women who ended up becoming judges and who ended up in the different levels of courts. But we often would have contact over the nature of the work that they would do on trying to stop violence against women, trafficking, child marriage, trafficking of women, failure to get to be able to divorce, not being allowed to take your boy children with you when there was divorce, and so on. So I was doing quite a bit of work on Afghanistan anyway. And then when there was the military evacuations, huge numbers of these women were left behind. I mean, unless their husband was employed in some military capacity, they weren't getting out. And I started getting phone calls from women judges. I look back on it now, and it was a sort of nightmare 3 months. And then it continued for years and still is going on, I have to tell you, Fiona, because I ended up having to find out how to charter planes. And in fact, the Ukraine-Russia war hadn't started at this time. It was the year before all of that. And so I chartered planes from, which were holiday planes from Ukraine. But they were hugely expensive, so I had to raise the money at the same time. And I was helped by my team of young lawyers who work for, in the Institute, because by this time I was the director of the Institute. And so, because I was invited to do that when I left Oxford. So I started the business of finding out what we could do to get these women out. And, it's a story to be told, but I had to liaise with people that I knew in Parliament who had been in the military and who had contacts there, people who could help. We had to find safe houses for them, and we were helped on the ground over that. I was helped by former intelligence people from our security services. And we ended up getting 100, it ended up being 3 planes over a period of a couple of months. I had to then organise what's called a lily pad, a place for them to land. And we got them out. It was 508 people, because the women had husbands, they had children, and we got them out. And then I found that I was very naive, and I innocently imagined the world would open its arms to women judges who had been doing such precious work to make a democracy in Afghanistan. And I'm afraid that already this antagonism towards the asylum seeker was already vogue. And it was very hard. Our own Home Office took in, for my group of women, certainly we only got 5. We've had more than that. A few have got in since via Pakistan. Basically, I've got eight women and their families here now who were prosecutors, who were judges. And of course, they're now all family to me, and they're great friends. But I mean, I have women all around. I've got them in Canada. I've got them in Australia. I had to liaise with every friend I had. I pulled them in, people that I knew in politics, but people I also knew in the senior levels in the legal profession. So we got them out, but it really was a lesson to me in how important it is that the legal community, for a start, but also that parliamentarians know why law is precious, know how hard it is for the people who often are struggling to build legal systems in places where the systems have been pretty unprotective and where there is arbitrary arresting and where there are disappearances and so on. And so my work now internationally is around those issues where law is very fragile in places, or in the current climate where we're seeing the rise of autocracies and autocrats ruling in what they call democracies, but where they've got it rigged in their own direction. And in many of those places, the rule of law is being dismantled. Places where we thought the rule of law was rooted. And I mean, we're seeing it in so many places. And so it's part of that pendulum swing. And we are lucky to live in a place where the rule of law, by and large, is respected. And we've got to see it as we are one of the voices for the importance of the rule of law. Britain is, the United Kingdom. And we've got to basically show that we are keeping to the rules ourselves.
And you're now supporting Ukraine after that tremendous experience in Afghanistan. You're now supporting Ukraine.
Yes.
Action.
Yeah, I mean, what happened? I mean, listen, one of the first things that I really sort of confronted me with the full horror of impunity and people getting away with things was the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, because that assassination, I was involved as one of the I was the criminal law person. There was there were four of us who were led by Agnes Kalamar, who was the rapporteur for extrajudicial killings. And we went out to Turkey, and I heard all those horrific tapes and so on from the Turkish security services because of that investigation into that killing. And, there's never been a proper accounting for that. And so impunity, unfortunately, it has become the way of the world at the moment. And we're seeing it in conflict. And after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I was asked to be part of a task force that was created to look at war crimes. Because if you remember, very early on, that we saw that people had their hands tied behind their backs and they'd been shot in the back of the head. Ordinary citizens in Busra. And I was part of that. And I started off really looking at the business of sexual violence in conflict, because women were being raped, and rape was very much part of being weaponized in that by Russian soldiers. And then the president's office asked if I would lead a task force because of the children that were being abducted and taken off into Russia. And I mean, that has been a shocking experience to see the extent to which, as a demoralizing effort to really undermine the Ukrainian people, large numbers of children have been basically lifted, taken into the vast mass that is Russia, and distributed across that whole nation. And so far we've got 2,000 back through, you have to do it under the radar negotiations using good offices of certain people. But there are real problems, and it's not that there's a shortage of law. I mean, there's plenty of law which is about protecting children in wartime. Plenty of law about, and there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child and so on. There's a lot of law, but I'm afraid law is pushed to the sides as soon as you have war. And then we've had the business in the Middle East and what happened in Gaza and the horror that were committed by Hamas. But then, unfortunately, the response being also contravening international law in relation to Geneva Conventions, in relation to the deprivation of medicine getting in, the humanitarian aid issues that arose. I mean, really horrifying conduct that one can only be shocked by. So in all those areas, I'm afraid our world is not looking great around the rule of law, and it's why Britain, the United Kingdom, has to be leading the way. And I feel very proud of the fact that we said invading Iran when we were in the middle of a negotiation was contrary to international law. I know that we've now been providing some assistance of a defensive nature, but that has to be carefully considered as to how you comply with international law in times, which isn't to say that a lot of my work has been around Iran in recent years. I knew Shirin Ebadi, who was a great woman lawyer who was given the Nobel Prize years ago, and what she experienced was hellish. And I got to know her when I was the president of SOAS, I was involved, very much involved in international education, and she really suffered. And there's a woman currently. There are whole sets of lawyers, and many of them women, who are in prison just now in Iran. And God knows what will happen if we pulverise, if we watch the pulverisation of Tehran, Evian prison, which is full of women lawyers, women who were detained over their own efforts to call for democracy. We've got to be mindful of the consequences of this on the very people whom we have sympathy with.
You've mentioned international treaties. I wanted to touch on the Refugee Convention because, of course, it links some of the work that you've been undertaking, particularly in relation to the Afghanistani female judges and prosecutors. And there's often debates about asylum that reduces it to political choices. But why is it constitutionally dangerous for the UK to treat obligations such as the Refugee Convention and other treaties as optional or worse?
The truth is that what happens is that people are rendered stateless because people will flee from persecution and their families will help them to do that. People say, how can they afford to, pay this money to traffickers? We only have to go back to the Second World War when many of the Jewish people who fled, and my own mother-in-law, one of them, Holocaust survivors who really suffered and lost so many of their own families. And who had to, sell their jewellery and, sell things in order to pay for their passage to get out and cross different countries in order to get to Britain. And then my mother-in-law became a very great doctor in the United Kingdom, eventually having been a serving maid during the war years. People made huge contributions, and we've got to always remember that we do have human obligations to each other. And the Refugee Convention was doing that. And once people start pulling out of it, as we've seen already happening, with the conduct of Hungary and places, once people start pulling away from those joint commitments, then, you really are unravelling law which was there for a good purpose. For me, law is not some technocratic thing. It is actually there to bind societies together, to bind our human world together. It's so painful to watch this unravelling as I see it. There's just been a report come out from the European Civil Liberties Organisation, which has reviewed what's been going on. And what we know, and what I know from the work that I'm currently doing on media freedom, on the travails of lawyers in many of these countries and judges, is that autocrats, what they do in places where you have populist nationalism is they want to blame people for the ills that there might be economically. And they will blame people of colour, they will blame people who are foreigners, and they will blame the refugee. And they go after the lawyers who act for them. They go after lawyers who act for the journalists who write the stories about corruption. The people who end up in jail are those people. And the other thing that happens is they seek to capture the judiciary. And so it's why as we watch the world, we see authoritarian governments' efforts to somehow, they use words like modernise or, reviewing the workings of the judiciary. And we've even got political parties here talking about wanting the Prime Minister to appoint senior judges in this country. God forbid,
Well, you've perfectly drawn me towards a question I wanted to ask about judicial independence, because the guide highlights that judicial independence is an essential feature of the rule of law. And when you look at the international landscape, what gives you confidence that the legal courage and professionalism can still hold the line against abuses of power?
Well, it is interesting because I have lots of contacts in the United States. I mean, when I was a young lawyer, I went out and spent some time as an intern with a law firm in New York and went to the Supreme Court and so forth, and I held it in very high esteem. And now I've watched, if we're talking about unravelling, a certain amount of unravelling. But there are also incredibly courageous judges in the United States who've really been holding true to the Constitution, the United States Constitution, really acting as lawyers should and using law. And it was interesting watching the recent decision on the tariffs, that those pieces of the American Constitution, which were all supposed to create checks and balances, the Supreme Court and Congress holding the president, that there was this sort of triumvirate And we've got a president now who basically ignores, has captured the court, but also ignores the Congress and goes ahead with what he wills. So the judges have been making very brave decisions at federal level, but also at state level. So all power to them, and I pay tribute to those who've done that. One of my great friends is a Judge Mark Wolf, a wonderful judge on the Massachusetts federal court. And he has recently stepped down and resigned because he felt that he wanted the liberty to be able to speak out about what was happening. And he's not some mad radical. He's not some lefty lawyer, you know. He is a man who's very concerned about corruption and how corruption is often, and the self-enriching is often at the heart of some of these autocracies, you know, that people are often enlarging their own wealth rather than sorting out the problems of the nation. And so he and many others like him are holding the fort. But in many places, the judiciary is captured. I mean, I was involved with when the election took place in Belarus. And yet again, the dictator there insisted that he had won. And the lawyer who'd acted for the opposition leader, who was himself jailed, the opposition leader, and the lawyer was also thrown in jail, Maxime Znak. And we don't know where he is. He's disappeared into that system and people don't even know if he's still alive. So the price paid by lawyers in, for example, places like Belarus, I mean, you were talking about totalitarian. I mean, in Belarus, the worst was that many of them were arrested and thrown in jail, but also because they acted for people who were arrested in demonstrations and so on. But they also had the experience of having their certificates of practice taken from them, their livelihood removed from them. So there are many ways in which, we also have to remind parliamentarians that protecting lawyers is also important. The independence of the legal profession is also important, because the lawyers have to be acting for people who are often deeply unpopular. You know, I mean, people used to, raise their eyebrows that I had done cases where I had acted for people who were charged with IRA offences. You know, everybody has to be, it's one of the great principles of our legal system is that you're not supposed to turn down cases because you don't like the sniff of them. You know, you don't like what the people are being charged with.
Cat rank rule.
And the cat rank rule is a really important thing. And and you don't get it, in the United States, people will absolutely make their choices about the kind of cases they will do. So I believe that our system actually sets a high bar, and I think it's why we have great lawyers.
Finishing off, because this is a question that I've been asking all of the guests on the podcast. You're an experienced parliamentarian, apart from obviously reading the Justice's Law for Lawmakers guide.
I love it. It's great. I mean, it's a great piece of work. I'm very proud of.
We have a great team writing it.
Yeah, well, didn't write it. I was only on the periphery, but I loved that we did that at Justice.
Well, apart from reading that and or speaking to the Justice team, what piece of advice would you give to incoming, whether they're peers?
Parliamentarians
exactly.
And peers. And we've got increasingly large numbers of new people. And I would say it's really important to spend time, go to meetings, read the briefings, read Justice's briefings. I mean, you all create really terrific briefings on legislation that's coming through, pointing out shortcomings, pointing out areas where there might be difficulty, where interpretation might be difficult for the courts. And those things are vital. And so I think that you have to expose yourself to an understanding of why law matters. And by God, does law matter. And maintaining high standards is so important. And there are people who are dismissive of law. I wrote a book once called Just Law, and it was because a whip once said to me, "Why are you making a fuss, Elena? It's just law."
Named the book after it.
I did, and I put Just Law because, of course, what we want is law that is just.
Thank you so much, Elena. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
I love justice, and And I also have a great deal of time for many of the parliamentarians who really, struggle with these issues and try to create decent law in this country. But it's hard work, and it's really important that we do it.
I know our listeners will have deeply valued the insights and the experience that you've brought to this particular conversation, particularly in relation to the international law and the rule of law in the UK and abroad. Thank you for listening to Law for Lawmakers. This guide that we've produced is not just for parliamentarians, it's for anybody who cares about the law and how it is made. If you want to know more about justice and our work and about the guide itself, please visit www.justice.org.uk. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends, family, colleagues. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.